The first whisper of dawn laid its pale coin of light on the tiles of the Red Keep, and in the long corridor outside the small council chamber, Oberyn Martell watched the glow crawl toward his boots and thought, as he often did, of blood. Not the theatrical gouts that men boasted of over wine. Not the thick clots drying in sawdust below a duelist's ring. Not even the quiet, private beads drawn by a lover's tooth. He thought of blood as memory, as contract, as the language of promise and vengeance both. He stood easy, as if merely passing a morning, his hands loose, a little smile playing on his mouth, while every turning of his mind was a knife being laid in its sheath. He had spent the night awake, though he'd been offered a bed with sheets that smelled of rosewater and starch. Sleep came easily to men at peace. He had slept well in youth. Now his rest, like his pleasures, was sharpened by an edge. They had wanted him quiet, tame, grateful for the courtesy of his rooms and the courtesy of wine. Courtesies could do a great deal of work when backed by power and the threat of steel, but he had never been the sort to mistake the cloth for the blade. He drained the wine because it was good, because the green apples in its nose and the faint bite of the wood were honest pleasures in a castle that had few honest things left in it. And when he set the cup down, when the moon slid past the eave, he had stood before the window and watched the city's breathing. Now the city breathed a new hour, and the man he had decided to save sat behind a door with 2 Lannister men-at-arms and a third with a face like dried leather. Tyrion Lannister was not a friend to him. Oberyn was too careful with that word, but the man's life had become useful, and besides, there was a thrum of sympathy he could not quite ignore. Tyrion's suffering had not been earned by the crime he was accused of. That made it, in Oberyn's geometry of the world, valuable and pliable. There was a shape in which it might fit his own designs. He turned when the leather-faced one coughed. "Prince Oberyn," the man said, as if he might be tempted to forget the title. "The imp is to be taken to the Tower of the Hand until the hour is named for the single combat." "The imp," Oberyn said, tasting the word and discarding it, "is called Tyrion, unless you mean to name him with the honesty of the charge. Murderer would do if he had killed the boy, but I am told he did not." The man smiled with only half his mouth. "That's for the gods to judge today, your grace." "Your grace is for a king," Oberyn said, and smiled in return. "I am a prince. It matters to me. Words matter to those who have been denied the right ones." Something in his voice made the leathery man shift on his feet, and Oberyn left it there. He desired no quarrel now, not before the hour had fully turned. He went to the door and knocked in the measured cadence he had used the last 2 nights. There was a pause and then the scrape of a chair. When the door opened, Tyrion stood in its frame with his hair like a scoured briar patch and the peculiar alertness in his eyes that had caught Oberyn's attention in the first place. Squeezed as that alertness was through the funnel of fear. "You should eat," Oberyn said, stepping past him. "I brought oranges. Dorne can be contained in a sphere if you know how to peel it properly." Tyrion shut the door with a glance for the guards. "They were quite clear that I am not to be comforted, and that you are to be suspected of every kindness. They are not entirely fools, then." Oberyn took the knife from his belt. Plain steel, the sort that could slice the world into pieces as easily as fruit, and laid it under the orange rind. The perfumed spray lit the air. "Still, a man should not go to face a mountain with an empty mouth." "Sound counsel," Tyrion said. "I will put it alongside my father's book of wisdom. Never trust a whore, never trust a brother, never drink alone, always drink alone." Oberyn looked at him with a slanted affection. Tyrion's jokes were a hedge against terror, but they were also the way he showed respect. "Do not trust me, then," Oberyn said mildly. "Trust my intention. I will win. If it comforts you to know so on the arithmetic of arms, know it. If it comforts you on the arithmetic of vengeance, know that better." "I have tried the sums 12 ways," Tyrion answered, taking the orange half and biting its flesh with small savage motions. "And they all come to the same number. My guilt is convenient coin. Your victory is inconvenient debt. The gods rarely favor inconvenience." Oberyn leaned on the table, studying Tyrion over the gleaming pool of juice in the wooden bowl. "The gods have a taste for spectacle," he said, and I have always preferred to feed gods as if they were men. Show them something bright and they'll take it for sacrament. Have you ever known a god to refuse a pretty gift? Tyrion cut a glance to the window, where the light was turning from pale to live gold. I've known them to refuse a great many prayers, but as for gifts, his smile was thin. That may be why men go on living. They sat a while in quiet. Oberyn, who did not worship silence, allowed it to take shape between them. It was like seeing a pattern in the weave. When he rose, he did it with the slow, oiled grace that made his enemies mistake him for a dancer and then remember too late that dancers learned balance to feed their blades. "It is time," Oberyn said. Tyrion wiped his mouth and nodded. The small hands that had caressed books and cups and women and, on occasion, knives, trembled as he set the orange aside. Oberyn pretended not to see. He opened the door, smiled pleasantly at the guards, and led Tyrion down the corridor into the day. The yard of combat had been dressed for cruelty and merriment alike. High cushions, the soft velvet buttocks of privilege, overlooked a ring of packed sand, and within it the chalk circle gleamed, as if it had already been salted with bones. Servants moved like gnats on a river's skin. Banners lifted their bright throats to the wind. People laughed because this, after all, was the city's most honest theater, and the actors bled. When the mountain came, Gregor Clegane with his helm like a cathedral bell lit by hellfire, there was a brief hush that was not reverence but relief. Men needed enormity to absolve themselves. If the monster was truly a monster, then the game was clean and they could cheer the hero without any trembling in their hearts. Oberyn found that he felt no disgust for the crowd. They had not stood at a child's bier, the bier of a sister. They had not known the precise weight of a broken skull. They were merely ready to be told what justice looked like. He stepped into the circle. He did not wear a helm. He wore a light shirt of scaled leather that caught the sun as if it had a mind to keep it. His spear, long and lean, balanced on his palm like the answer to a question. Even the air around him seemed to stand more carefully. He heard Illyria's breath somewhere high behind him, felt it in the way he could feel the heat of the sand even through his boots. It made a wicked tenderness in him, one that he had learned to shelter the way a man shelters a lamp in wind. He walked forward, closing the distance by fractions. The great beast shifted, and the helm turned slightly as if listening to the rumor of a fly. Oberyn felt the size of him, the way a sailor feels the first heave of a storm under the planking. It was an old sensation, thrilling and sexual and lit with a calm that did not belong to the world. He had always done his best work inside calm. For a beat of time too small to count, he closed his eyes and saw Elia. He let the vision be simple because complicated memories were less true. She stood on the terrace at Sunspear with her hair unbound, a thin dress fluttering against her shins, and the little girl. No, Oberyn would not speak the little girl's name here, not in this ring. He held her name in the strictest temple of himself, the little girl clapping at swallows in laughter sharper than the wind. Oberyn let the throat of that memory close, leaving behind an oath like metal in the mouth. "What do you want of me?" he called to the mountain, in a voice pitched for the cushions as well as for the sand. The helm tilted. "Your death," the man said, and his breath made a sound inside the metal like the grinding of old hinges. "Then come and collect it," Oberyn said, and he spun the spear up and let it kiss the margin of the man's range, a whisper at the edge of a roar. They danced. Could not be called anything else. The mountain did not deserve grace as a word, but movement had its own economy and demanded to be named honestly. Oberyn's steps were precise, heel and toe in a logic that wore the shape of play. Clegane's were earth-shifting, hungry, as if the ground itself fed his legs. The first lunge took a ribbon of leather from Oberyn's sleeve and left no blood. The second took a line of red from Clegane's thigh through the armor seam, and that was a little poem on the sand. Oberyn let the poem be seen. He did not, this time, ask for names or confessions. He saved his breath for the work. He had learned something from the way a courtroom uses words. Words were coins, only useful if you knew where to spend them. At the edge of the circle, Tyrion stood under the watch of 4 guards now instead of 2. Oberyn saw him with a portion of his eye, as he saw everything. The dwarf's mouth was a straight, thin wound across his face. Cersei shone like a cut jewel. Tywin had the serenity of the man who believes in the arithmetic of the world and the rightness of his own hands moving across its abacus. Oberyn reflected that there were many pleasures he had not yet tasted. The pleasure of spitting in Tywin's eye while bowing properly might be one. He shifted his weight and struck. The spear slid under the arm, found the tender meat above the elbow, and bit. The mountain's roar folded the air. Oberyn withdrew without haste, paintbrush smooth, and the spear came away shining. A heartbeat later he felt it. The weight in his wrist, the trembling of the shaft where iron had tried to hold it. He stepped again, and each step was an instruction. This is where you put the foot. This is where you breathe. Clegane came in a hammering charge that made the crowd flinch backward as if the air had become a beast. Oberyn let him come. He turned at the last instant, sickle clean, and the spears but caught the back of a knee. The monster staggered, but only a little. The knee found itself again. Oberyn tasted the edge of danger and smiled because it had remembered his name. The mountain's sword, an ungentlemanly thing, cut a black arc through sun. Oberyn bent his back in a shape a lover might make when language breaks in the throat. The sword missed him by the width of a cherry stem and smashed a divot of sand that stung his ankles. They were both breathing hard now. The face under the helm made an ugly sound. Oberyn let his mouth open just enough to draw air and looked toward the platform where the king sat, small and pale as if someone had carved a boy from wax and fitted a crown to him. Oberyn, who had seen enough children damaged by the accidents of their birth to know the passage of pity by its scent, felt none. The boy had chosen. The boy had continued to choose. He let the king's presence move across him like wind past a reed, and then he was all blade. When the end came, it did not come in a single tidy motion as in the songs. It came in a series of near things that, caught together, made a seam and then a ripping sound at the world's edge. Oberyn feinted high and low simultaneously with a trick of the wrists that Ser Aaron of Starfall had taught him one rainy week when they had been lovers and bored. He dragged the tip across the plates, found a joint, and put the iron tooth in where tendons are nervous little animals. The mountain staggered, then in that lurching found his balance. The sword hissed, and Oberyn felt heat along his ribs where the armor had torn and his flesh had not. He pivoted. A spray of sand rose, blinding. He knew where the man would be because men like Clegane always owned the same furniture in their minds. Step, kill, there is no chair for doubt in their rooms. Oberyn turned into that certainty and drove the spear up under the rim of the gorget. He did not say a name. He did not say a word. He used the strength of his legs. The point climbed, parted mail, bit like a spitting cat, and kept going. He felt it take meat, felt it scrape something hard, and heard the sound as the helm's eye slits flooded. The noise the mountain made became a wind with a rock in it. He swung with both hands at nothing. He dropped to one knee like a prayer badly said. Oberyn let go the spear. He reached for the dagger at the small of his back, although it was not needed. The great man's hands clawed at his own throat as if he had swallowed a hook. The crowd did not cheer at first. They were quiet the way a room is quiet when a truth walks in naked. Then they shouted. The banners woke from their daze. The boy king rose, knocking something over. Cersei's face had become a cut pumpkin. Tywin's lips thinned to a thread and snapped invisibly. Oberyn, breathing now, reached out and placed one hand on the shaft buried under the gorget. He pushed it the last half-inch, slow, to make sure the lesson entered cleanly. Then he stepped back and let the mountain fall. They carried the corpse away by inches, as if afraid it would roll and crush them even in death. The sand drank and remembered. Oberyn stood in the circle, dust on his lashes, and bowed. Not to the throne, not to the gods, not to the crowd, but to the idea that had brought him there and which was not done with him yet. Tyrion Lannister, he said when the herald had bleated and the queen had argued and the old men had fussed and then, grudgingly, obeyed the laws they had come long ago to rely on. You are free. Tyrion's laugh was small and wrong in the throat, like something that had not been used for a while. Am I? He asked, his eyes already moving, counting doors, counting blades, counting the exact number of smiles directed at him like a set of arrows aimed high. "For a little while," Oberyn said. "And sometimes a little while is exactly the opening a man needs." He did not wait for ceremony. He crossed the sand, dirtying the cuffs of his light boots, and put his arm very courteously in Tyrion's. The guards looked uncertain. In a city where certainty had always been made of gold and lies, uncertainty was a weather that invigorated him. He led Tyrion from the yard to the side passage, through a kitchen that smelled of butter and scorn, past a corridor lined with tapestries of hunts that no one had ever conducted. A boy tried to stop them with his spear, lifting it bravely the way one lifts a reed against a tide. Oberyn complimented the boy on his stance and kept walking. By the time the boy seemed to decide to stab them, they had taken the second stair and were gone from his furniture of the mind. "Where?" Tyrion said when they were in a dim cloister with carved saints whose eyes had been scratched out long ago. He stood hunched, not only because of his back but because the day felt too heavy to wear upright. "Out," Oberyn said simply. A small word covers a world. It took less than a world and more than a street. The Red Keep was a machine for swallowing time, but even machines can be fed their own teeth. Oberyn had arranged for certain doors to be unlocked at certain hours, for a stable boy to be somewhere else, for a barrel to be mislaid near a wall, for 2 gold cloaks to be occupied by dice and a woman with a painted mouth who had been paid twice not to care. Some of it would have been impossible if Varys had chosen otherwise, and some of it was possible because Varys preferred men to think he was essential to every success, and men will always oblige men like that. Oberyn had, last night, pressed a single coin into the eunuch's palm. It had not been a bribe. It had been a courtesy. There are acts that look like bribery but are in truth the setting of a table. On the quay below Blackwater Rush, the water looked like beaten pewter. A small ship rocked at her ropes, her hull the color of toast, her name a decent, forgettable word, the Swan. She had a crew of 8 and a captain with a face like an old map that had been folded along the same lines too many times. He saw Oberyn and touched 2 fingers to the brim of nothing. The poor have their courtesies, and sometimes they are the only thing left that belongs to them. Oberyn guided Tyrion up the plank with a hand that steadied without being kind, and when the deck took them he felt something unlock in his ribs that had been tight since he had first come to King's Landing, perhaps since he had been born. "Is it truly as simple as this?" Tyrion asked. He had to squint at the light. The world seemed larger on water, perhaps because land teaches men to believe in walls. "It is never simple," Oberyn said, "but simple is how things appear to those who do not do the labor of making them so. See, the captain has a wine not entirely unlike vinegar. It will wake you to your freedom." The Swan did not cut the water so much as persuade it. The city receded, a toy puzzle set back into its box by a bored child. The wind rose shyly and then grew bolder. Some gulls followed them for a while, long enough to be certain they would not be offered anything clever, then gave up. Oberyn stood at the rail and let the salt outline his lips. He had one, and that was a kind of promise. He had not yet begun, and that was a kind of hunger. Tyrion came to stand beside him. He had drunk the captain's wine and grimaced without shame. His face had color now high in the cheeks. "I should thank you," he said. "I suppose I must. But I cannot help noticing that your generosity has a very Dornish scent." "It smells of sun," Oberyn said, "and oranges, and something sharp." "And something sharp," Tyrion echoed, the edge of humor returning. "Very well. I'll not sniff at it like a suspicious dog. You rescued me from the stage where I was to be cut into neat speeches. Whatever you want in return is in my interest as well, at least today." "Dorne, then." "Dorne," Oberyn said. The word was a cup to his mouth. He looked south, where invisible lines on maps became deserts in truth, where the air lost its moorings and light took on a flavor. Sunspear first. The water gardens, if we are particular. There is a prince there who must be reminded the world is not made to be watched through latticed windows. There are girls who will want to be told a story that is not fit for them. There is a city of salt where men learn that a wound, carried properly, is a tool. "You speak as if the land loves you," Tyrion said. "It does not love me," Oberyn answered, and his smile turned private. "It is my mother. Mothers have a way of forgiving their sons anything, especially if the sons make them proud in public and weep for them in private. Dorne taught me to be patient with thirst. King's Landing taught me to be patient with fools. Between the two, I have an education rare enough to be useful." The days passed on the water like beads being clicked along a string by a blind man. There was the monotony of a small crew, men who smelled of rope and a loneliness too old for complaint, and the little dramas of the sea. A sail traced on the horizon and then lost, a storm that never quite decided whether it wanted them, a night as glassy as a polished floor. Tyrion found a way to be useful with the captain's figures, albeit in a style that would have made a maester huff. Numbers obeyed him because he treated them as if they were charming liars. Oberyn practiced with his spear in the early hours when the deck was mist-slick and cold enough to make a man honest. They spoke only in the second half of each afternoon, after the heat had wrung the sweat from them and the low sun laid a path toward the south as if indicating a road. Tyrion had not asked what, precisely, Oberyn envisioned next. By temperament he distrusted visionaries, and Oberyn had no desire to rehearse plans that might be overheard by men who could be less curious if they were ignorant. Instead, they told each other stories at a slant, the way men who do not trust easily learn to communicate. Tyrion told Oberyn about a book he had loved that no one had ever cared to borrow, and how he would look at its spine in his chambers the way one looks at a sleeping dog that might wake and remember its training. Oberyn told Tyrion about a woman in Planky Town who could balance 3 cups on her forehead while making another woman forget the name of her husband. Tyrion told Oberyn he had tried to be a good son and failed. Oberyn told Tyrion he had tried to be a good brother and sometimes succeeded, though not in the one way that mattered when the world was at its worst. They did not say the names of the dead. Names soaked in blood required a solemnity the deck could not hold. On the 5th morning, the sea exchanged its clean, severe scent for something warmer. The gulls changed their voices. The horizon, which had been a philosophy, became a place. The first faint line of Dorne lay on the water like a dream that had learned to take itself seriously. Tyrion came to the rail and stood with his hands clenched until the knuckles were white. "What will you ask of me?" he said without preface. "When we touch that sand and the world becomes a list again, what task will you write under my name?" Oberyn felt the swell lift the ship and set her down with a sigh. "I will ask you to be what you have always been," he said. "A mind in a room where most men bring swords." "A mind," Tyrion said. "I have offered that mind to many masters. It is still mine mostly because men prefer to own simpler animals." "Then let us exploit their preference," Oberyn said softly. "There is a shape to the fall of King's Landing that pleases me. It does not look like fire from a dragon's mouth. It looks like a chair in a garden being pulled out from under an old man." "Tywin," Tyrion said. It was not a question. "Tywin is the chair," Oberyn said. "Many have broken their backs on the floor because they forgot that. Others prefer to strike at the sun. He is a blade that points in every direction but his." He added with a glance sideways. "Forgive me. I am too tired not to," Tyrion said, "and too grateful." The swan nosed into the little harbor where the water wore ribs of reflected stone. Planky Town announced itself not with beauty but with a truth as valuable. It was a place that had made a truce with necessity and found a way to profit from it. The quays stank magnificently. The stalls were loud with barter in 3 languages and a dialect made entirely of gesture. A woman shouted about eels with the fervor of a priest calling men to grace. A man with a jaw like a cracked teacup sold knives that would never hold an edge but looked brave, the way a poor man needs his knife to look. They went ashore. The sun took Tyrion by the shoulders. He had been pale even for a Lannister. The light now wrote on him with a blunt stick. Oberyn took him through the stalls not because he needed anything but because passage is a negotiation, and it is always good to be seen on one's way from the sea into a land that is yours. He bought a handful of dates and put them in Tyrion's palm, ignoring the way the vendor tried to charge them like princes. Tyrion bit the first and made an involuntary sound that put a little light in Oberyn's chest. "What does it cost?" Tyrion asked, chewing. "Less than you fear," Oberyn said. "More than you will wish, they hear. Fresh horses, the kind that tolerate heat better than men do, and a cart for their chests and the crew's few gifts for their families." The road toward Sunspear was a ribbon thrown over a table, and the day unrolled upon it like a story finding its patience. The land grew itself from dry bones, scrub that smelled of courage, distant hills gaveling the light, a sky so wide it made every ambition seem not grand but appropriate. They spent one night in an inn made of adobe and stubbornness, where the owner's daughter brought them a stew that had started with onions and achieved a small miracle between the pot and the table. Tyrion drank a brown beer that gave up its bitterness reluctantly and then, as if ashamed of having been sour at all, turned soft. Oberyn gambled with 3 shepherds and a soldier on leave whose shoulders told a history of carrying too much in youth. He lost deliberately until the shepherds felt themselves brave and then won a little back, enough to leave everyone smiling and no one desperate. He had long ago learned that the best way to carry a plan through a land is to leave behind the ghost of a prince who paid his due. When Sunspear appeared at last, it did not appear. It emerged. It had the quality of a thing that has not been built so much as convinced into existence from the pressure of heat and salt and old song. The spear towers were not simply tall. They were elegant in a way that had nothing to do with fragile beauty. They were arguments made stone. The shadow of the long keep lay across the water like the hand of a lover nosing its way toward the belly of afternoon. Tyrion's breath hitched audible even under the noise of the gate. "I expected some grandeur," he said carefully. "I did not expect it to be this happy with itself." "It is not happy," Oberyn said. "It is sure. If King's Landing belonged to mouths, Sunspear belonged to eyes and hands. People looked, and after they looked they used their hands to make, to count, to hold. Even the beggars held themselves as if they had chosen their fate, reserving some scarecrow dignity that charity could not bruise. Oberyn slowed so they could see him see them. He let a boy run alongside his horse for 3 streets and then gave him a copper and a piece of string that had once been tied around one of Valeria's thighs. The boy, who did not know the provenance and did not need to, went away whistling like a kettle. At the gates to the water gardens, he felt himself breathing again in the way men breathe when the roofs are the right color and the water speaks in the right accent. The pomegranate trees shook their bells. Children ran where the paths widened, leaving behind wet footprints that the sun drank before their next step had landed. A piper played a tune that knew it was minor but persisted in sounding cheerful. Oberyn swung off his horse and put his hand on the trunk of a fig tree. He had not realized until then that he had been carrying a different weight than the spear these past months. Prince Dorne received him not as a victor or a prodigal but as a brother. That was mercy. He sat in his wheeled chair in the shade of an arcade and looked at Oberyn with a long consideration that had less fatigue in it than Oberyn had feared and more steel than many realized. Doran's hands were fleshy but not soft. They folded over each other as if in prayer for patience or survival. Valeria stood a little behind, her smile like dried wine on the lip of a cup, and the sand snakes stood with the thoughtless beauty of youth that believes beauty is a strategy. "What news, brother?" Dorne said, after the first courtesies, after the dates and the small bite of cheese and the kiss for Valeria that had been polite and private both. "The mountain is dead," Oberyn said. The sand snakes made a sound like girls at a fair. Then they saw his face and swallowed it back into their ribs. Doran's lips did not move into any shape of triumph. "And you?" Dorne asked. "I am sufficient," Oberyn said. "The wound is a scratch. My pride has had worse. And the capital? Still standing. But I took something that had been needed there. A myth that Tywin kept in his pocket. It is in our pocket now. Or perhaps we will give it to a beggar to buy bread." Doran's eyes slid to Tyrion, and the weariness that was his mask became curiosity. "You have brought a dangerous gift." "I have brought a mind," Oberyn said. "It sits too close to a wound to be comfortable to anyone. But I judge we can use the discomfort if we are clever." Tyrion bowed, deeply and without ostentation. He had learned at last that in Dorne bending one's back could be a statement of equality rather than subservience. "Your Highness," he said, and the words, surprisingly, did not curdle in his mouth. "My father and sister will call me Runaway." There is nothing they can call me that is untrue. It may be that I have done terrible things. It is certain that I have not done this one. If any of that is useful to your purposes, then take it. If not, I will plant onions in a corner of your garden and die unimportant." One of the sand snakes laughed, not unkindly. Illyria's eyes softened. Dorne nodded once, a movement so small that it could have been a trick of leaf shadow. "Food first," he said, "then talk. One cannot think with grace while the stomach is sulking." They ate on the terrace where the sound of children made the air buoyant. The table smelled of lemons. Oberyn watched Tyrion as he ate, watched him realize slowly that the food was not a trap, that the wine was good not because it wanted something but because Dorne had managed the miracle of wanting good things for their own sake. He watched him put down his knife and lift it again with a small apology to no one. Afterward, Dorne gestured them into a smaller room whose latticework made the sunlight lace their cheeks. He motioned to servants, and the servants disappeared as if invented only for that gesture. Silent, he made itself comfortable among the cushions. "You will ask me for something," Dorne said to Oberyn. "I have sat here long enough to know when the posture of my brother is a cup waiting to be filled. Tell me the shape of your thirst." Oberyn leaned forward. The spear was not in his hand. It lay against a wall, a quiet promise. He spoke in a tone that was not the tone for fighting, and not the tone for lovemaking, but the tone of men building a bridge they intend never to cross themselves. He laid out the threads. Tywin Lannister sat at the center of a web whose strands were contracts, debts, promises, blackmail, gratitude, and fear. He had ensured that every man who touched power in the city felt the stickiness of those strands, so that if the web shook once in one place it trembled in 20 and no one dared twitch too hard lest he bring the whole thing down on his own head. Oberyn proposed that they make the web tremble in a pattern so elaborate that it would appear to be the shaking of the wind rather than the arrival of a hand. They would pull at debts in Old Town through men who owed the Redwine fleet favors they had not paid in 17 summers. They would touch the purse of the Iron Bank with a feather so that it wondered whether copper might be dearer in the future than gold. They would send a rumor through the brothels that the queen had a penchant for a manner of tenderness that the gods disliked, and another rumor through the septs that a certain high septon was considering a pilgrimage to Dorne for the sake of his joints. They would do 100 small things, none of which drew blood, and the city would sway. "And when it sways," Tyrion said when Oberyn paused, "when the people turn their heads toward the sound like dogs smelling rain, then what? Then nothing?" Oberyn said, smiling like a knife lying quiet under cloth. "We let them tire of swaying. We let them long for stillness. And while they are looking for a chair to sit upon, we take away the chair. We do it without fire. We do it without a banner raised. And when Tywin falls, he will fall so quietly that his blood will not stain the floor but only soak it, leaving a darker patch that the servants will pretend they do not see." Dorne had listened without moving any part of him beyond the eyes. Now he touched his fingers together and made a steeple that mocked and honored the faith all at once. "It is a patient plan," he said. "I have been a patient man," Oberyn said. "You have been an impatient man who has learned patience," Dorne corrected. "That is better. Impatience teaches a man where to look. Patience teaches him when. It is the combination that makes history favorable to him." Tyrion was frowning. "You will forgive me," he said, "if I find myself agitated by the prospect of watching a chair removed from under my father without the satisfaction of seeing him hit the stones with his teeth." Oberyn's smile turned to something almost gentle. "You shall have another satisfaction. You shall have his confusion. A man like Tywin can accept pain because he does not credit the world with the power to surprise him. Surprise him, and you take from him more than blood." "And Cersei?" Tyrion asked. "And the king who was or king who would be next, and the child king who seems to have been built to be feared or pitted depending on the light. No one rules alone." "No," Oberyn said, and he let his eyes travel to the garden where children were now chasing a lizard that had pretensions to dragonhood. "No one rules alone. That is why webs are strong and why they can be undone. For Cersei we have wine and whispers. For the child we have a better story than the one he is living. For the king who follows we have the sand under his feet." He will not know it's been replaced with water until he sinks. It was not the fullness of a plan, and it was not meant to be. It was the architecture in the mind that comes before craftsmen take out their tools. Doran said nothing for several breaths. He had the gift of silence that makes rooms gather themselves to one's purpose without any insult being done to their own dignity. "At dawn," he said at last, "we will go to the water gardens and sit among the children. Men do their best thinking among children. One is reminded that there was a time one learned freely. You will tell me which debts, which names, which rumors you believe are strings to be pulled first. You will tell me how much coin and whose coin, if not ours. We must be cautious, Oberyn. We will not turn Dorne into the anteroom of someone else's revenge. We will turn the capital into the anteroom of Dorne," Oberyn said. Doran's gaze held his for a long moment. It was not anger. It was the deep old love of a brother who knows where the younger's arrogance can cut him. "We will turn the capital into a place for our children to walk without having to borrow anyone's shame," he said finally. "That is the language we will use in my halls." Oberyn lowered his eyes in acknowledgement. The correction was not a blade. It was a whetstone. He could feel himself sharpen. That night, in the room set aside for them, Tyrion stood at the window and looked out over the fountain's patient spout. The water fell, gathered, and fell again with the absolute memory of its purpose. The moon's coin lay in the basin and seemed content to be drunk by the eyes of men. "They will come for me," Tyrion said at last. "My sister does not leave even threadbare toys lying about when she's done with them. She throws them in the fire. Or she has someone else do it so that she can pretend a certain purity." Oberyn poured wine. It smelled of peaches and a little smoke. "Let her come," he said, and the way he said it made the sentence both invitation and sentence. "We will make her pay a toll at every crossing. In time, even the river will ask her why she persists." Tyrion took the cup. He drank and made an appreciative sound. "If this ends with the city and fire and children screaming, I will consider it a failure. I have seen enough screaming." "So have I," Oberyn said quietly. "That is why we will do it this way." Tyrion nodded into his cup. The candle flame found his profile and made a landscape of it, both ravaged and stubbornly beautiful in its own ungentle geometry. "I trust you," he said, sounding surprised. "Or at least I trust this plan more than I distrust your motives. For me, that is the same thing." Oberyn, who had never asked for trust and did not expect it, felt that truth touch him as unexpectedly as a child's hand. He turned away so that Tyrion would not see his face soften. He was a man who could kill a mountain, but there were still muscles in his expression he preferred to keep sheathed. In the morning, the children taught them something neither had expected. They had gone to the water gardens as Doran had decreed, to sit and watch, to lay the map of their design over the world where innocence was still permitted to behave as if the map did not exist. A girl with hair like bright spills of ink approached Tyrion with the scrupulous curiosity of the very young and asked, in a voice loud enough to shame courtiers into honesty, why he was so small. Tyrion, to Oberyn's fascination and gratitude, did not laugh falsely or bristle. He considered, lifted one finger to arrange his thought, and said, "Once, before I was born, the gods tried to fold me into a smaller parcel so they could carry me more easily. But I wriggled too much, and they dropped me, and here I am." The girl thought about that and then nodded, satisfied by the myth. "You can wriggle here too," she said, and seized his hand with a possessiveness that was not unkind. He allowed himself to be taken to the fountain, where an elaborate game about a lizard and a dragon had recommenced. Oberyn watched him standing among the children, not taller than some of them, his face open. Something in Oberyn settled then. It was not forgiveness. He would not have given that word to any Lannister upon the earth. It was something cleaner, an admission that a man who can be sized correctly by children may have his uses when the grown are lying. Ilaria came and stood at his shoulder. Her arm brushed his. "You look as if the spear were suddenly lighter," she murmured. "It is," he said. "Something has changed weight in the room. It will make the next hour possible." "The next hour," she echoed. I assume you intend to seize about 100 next hours in sequence and call it a strategy. I intend to seize the second hour, he said. The first is already in our pocket. The third will take care of itself if we do not get greedy. She laughed low in her throat, proud and a little sad. I have missed you when you talk this way. There are not many languages I enjoy listening to when I cannot join in. You will join, he said, and turned to press his mouth against her hair. It smelled of salt water and figs. I will need everything you have. I will need your cruelties and your mercy, and the way you see the truth in a man's laugh before he hears it himself. They watched the children splash Tyrion until his hair lay like a drowned hedgehog, and his laughter, when it came, was not a tactic. It made Oberyn wish briefly that the world could be divided only into gardens and kitchens and beds. He let the thought be foolish and let it go. By the second bell of the morning, they were seated again with Dorne, with Arianne watching like a cat. Tail lazy, eyes sharp, pretending to be disinterested to make her interest more valuable. Maps lay spread like sheets after a night's mischief. A list of names had been written in Oberyn's tight hand, the script that looks like a flock of blackbirds in neat migration. Bankers, septons, captains, petty lords, no one listened to who still managed keyholders to the cellars of influence. Dorne's spymaster, a woman with a voice so soft that men told her things merely to feel it again, brought word from the Whispers and the shadowed end of Sandship Alley that a certain merchant who handled shipping manifests for a certain Lion Crimson house had been beating his second boy, and that the boy might be eager to make his own life with coin earned elsewhere. There is no lever longer than a son in a house that pretends the father is law. Begin here, Dorne said, and tapped the boy's name. Not because it is the strongest string, but because it is the one least likely to sing out when plucked. If it breaks, no one will hear. If it holds, we will know the instrument is tuned. While that is done, Oberyn said, I will write to the Iron Bank in a language they adore, the language of caution and opportunity. We will not ask anything. We will present them with an arithmetic that interestingly rearranges itself if a certain throne is occupied by a body less stable than theirs. They do not believe in thrones. They believe in chairs with ledgers beside them. You intend to become a banker, Tyrion said dryly. My father would admire you if you were not you. I intend to make bankers become Dornish for long enough to remember what thirst feels like, Oberyn answered. Doran's lips made the smallest curve. Send also to Old Town, not to the archmasters, they are made of fat and dust, but to the boys who will be maesters in 3 years. We will teach them that there are fortunes to be made in silence as well as in speech. Their letters home will carry the truth we wish, and the chain will oblige the link. And the brothels? Ilaria asked sweetly. Do we let King's Landing keep its other ministry unrivaled? I could name 3 women, 2 men, and one who will not be named in either column who could rearrange half the court with size. Send them, Oberyn said, but send them with strict accounting and a very fine knife in the hem. We will not lose anyone we love to someone else's clumsy appetite. Love, one of the sand snakes murmured, and smirked with the carelessness of 19. Is that what we are calling the thing we share with strangers now? We call it what pays, Ilaria said, with a softness that contained an exacting mathematics. We call it the name that lets it come home alive. So the first threads were tied. Letters went out with couriers who had no idea they were couriers. A purse changed hands, then returned to the same hand with different coin inside it and a responsibility it had not held before. Tyrion dictated a script for a series of small plays that would be performed in the poorer squares of the capital, the sort with a clever donkey and a foolish man in a yellow hat, whose only purpose was to allow a certain line about a king needing a good chair and a better cushion to be repeated in 100 mouths that had never before thought to talk of chairs at all. Oberyn arranged for a shipment of salt fish to be delayed quietly for 2 days, and then allowed through with a surfeit that would crash the price for a week, just long enough for a minor lord who had overextended himself to discover humility. The lord had a cousin in the city watch. The cousin had a habit of gambling on days that ended in Y. Each action was a drop of water falling on stone. None of them were the fall itself. But there is a time when water becomes a behavior and behavior becomes a law. At night, when the gardens breathed out the day and children slept like little sacks of grain, Oberyn lay awake with Illyria's arm across his belly and listened to the fountain talk to itself about gravity. He rehearsed failures as a way to seduce success. The mountain had been the simplest of his tasks. A man who believed in his own edges, who could be persuaded with physics. This thing now was not physics. It was theology for minds that did not believe in gods. It would require losses. He thought of whose name would be written under those losses and accepted the truth with the stern tenderness a man reserves for his own flaws. Some of them would be people he had made one way or another. He would need to mourn correctly without losing his pace. Tyrion, in his room, wrote by candle. He held the quill like a weapon. The light made his shadow taller than his body. He did not look at it. He thought of his brother, of Jaime's half-smile, the one that made you feel you were not alone even when he was, of the warmth of the palm that had covered his face once in boyhood when the world was loud. He thought of his father sitting with the weight of the house in his hands the way a butcher holds meat. He thought of Shay in a room that stank of soap and regret. He thought of the red keep stones which had eyes. He thought of his own face which had learned its angles too early. He wrote a sentence and then crossed half of it out because it sounded false to him in a way he could not afford. When dawn bled the horizon, Oberyn rose. He went to the room where the spear stood and spoke to it, not because he was a fool, but because a man must sometimes rehearse his vows to the least likely listener if he wants to remember them before the necessary ones. He told the spear he would not use it in the city, not unless all the other tools failed. He told it that if he did use it there, he would accept the cost of turning a clean instrument into a dirty one. He told it that he had killed a mountain and that had not yet satisfied him, and he told it that he was trying to become a man for whom satisfaction was set aside more often than it was pursued. The spear said nothing, being a spear, but in the silence there was a little approval, or else Oberyn gave it to himself and could not tell the difference. Men often confused their weapons with their certainty. The first answers from the capital came back 3 weeks later, folded into a letter about a wedding for a minor cousin, and in the coded postscript one could see how much work the messenger had done to keep the line straight. The boy had been angered properly by his father's hand. He had met a man who sold oranges, because every useful conversation in King's Landing eventually passed by a piece of fruit. He had spoken a name. The name belonged to a clerk who had begun to worry about his daughter's chance of marrying well if bread prices rose again, and who could be persuaded that bread might be more affordable if certain writs found their way into a drawer that was never opened. The writs concerned nothing significant, which was exactly why they mattered. If one train of men learned to be comfortable with small disobediences, the distance to large ones became shorter underfoot. From the Iron Bank there came nothing, which was the best possible reply. Silence in Bravos is the letter that says, "We are thinking of you against our better judgment." From Old Town there arrived not one reply but 3, and in them Oberyn saw the future bending slightly. The first was the letter of a student who had not yet learned to lie. Earnest, smudged, full of the right ideas in the wrong order. The second came from his sweetheart, not meant for any prince's eyes, in which she wrote that he had spoken of a prince's thought as if it were a new theorem he might prove with sufficient patience. The third was from a quietly ambitious don of a lesser order, who was too clever to address the prince directly and instead offered, in a letter to a friend of a friend, a lecture on the ethics of intervention in civic hunger with a footnote about how cheap grain can be a form of siege. Oberyn read them all twice. He broke bread with Dorne in the late afternoon and laid the papers beside the olives. He saw the set of his brother's mouth and knew that in that room the web had trembled not from wind, but from the careful touch of their hands. "Continue," Dorne said simply. They did. The city did not fall. Of course it did not. Cities never do the courteous thing when asked once. But a whorehouse shut its doors one morning for an hour for the first time in AD. Icade and the men who had come for their usual hour discovered they had unusual time in which to discover they could be angry. A minor lord found that his 5th best horse had been borrowed by a cousin who was in debt to a dice table. The cousin, spooked, came to the city watch with a story about a fight and a chest that had slid from one warehouse to another along an alley like a chess piece in a game only 2 men knew how to play. A clever raw-boned girl in flea bottom told a tale on a corner about a queen who loved her brother and could not keep her mouth off his, and the watchers laughed because laughter is how the poor save their own dignity when they revise the king's. Tyrion counted the days and the tides and wrote letters to two men who would never admit to owning the letters but who would sleep with them under their pallets until the ink grew stale. And then, when the city had only just begun to suspect there was something wrong with its balance, when Tywin had only just started to lean forward slightly in his chair without knowing why, a little matter of inheritance surfaced like a fish at sunset. A Florent cousin, previously assumed healthily dead, was found to be healthily alive but ailingly clever. A woman who owned half the shares in a shipyard died an inconveniently natural death and left her holdings to a niece who had more suitors than sense but enough sense to enjoy the suitors. The niece had been at the water gardens one summer and remembered with tenderness the way a Dornish girl had taught her to float. She laughed when she spoke the memory to the man who asked her to consider a certain unusual sail. She signed a paper with a flourish. The shipyard's schedules shivered. Ships that were meant to be repaired on Tuesdays found themselves mysteriously unable to be mended until Friday. A captain in a hurry is a man who overpays and underthinks. He bribes the wrong guard. He tells the wrong whore the right secret. Oberyn, reading the reports in the shade while the garden pomegranates pushed their hearts to ripeness, felt an old ache loosen. It was not victory, not remotely, but it was movement. He closed his eyes and let the sun lay a coin on his eyelids. Tyrion, across from him, was making a list of everything that could go wrong. It was an honest list, and in writing it he found himself less afraid. Fear had always swelled in him when it had no words. Give it words, and it had corners. He drew lines between items. He drew an arrow where a bribe might be more useful than a threat, and a circle where a threat might be nourished into a rumor and then, at the last moment, converted back to a bribe. He wondered, not for the first time, what it would have been like to be born in a house that did not make him draw such lists in wine-stained rooms. He wondered if he would ever stop wondering. It was almost quiet, then this conspiracy. It carried the discipline of gardeners more than soldiers. There was pruning and the careful tying of stems. There were hours spent waiting for shoots that might or might not take the sun. There were setbacks that did not dignify themselves with the drama of blood. An old woman who had been meant to speak a line in a brothel play died on her stool and had to be replaced with a younger woman who did not yet know how to make men more relaxed than they thought they had a right to be. A ship whose cargo was meant to arrive late arrived on time because the weather chose to be loyal to no prince. A boy found that his father had also learned to hit with a left hand and not only a right one. The boy left the house in the night with a little bag and did not come to the door where he had been expected because he chose instead to sit by the river and consider becoming a different kind of man than anyone had guessed. Oberyn took these as the texture of the world rather than its refusal. He moved through Sunspear with ease, slept when he needed to, loved Ilaria as if they were, for that hour, not the instruments of a plan but the plan itself. He sparred with his daughters. No man fathers the sand snakes and calls them only his. He fathered them the way a gardener fathers fruit, by tending the tree. He let them beat him when the day called for it and thrashed them when their arrogance would have gotten them killed had the opponent been made of something other than affection. He bled in the cheerful way a man bleeds among those who will not use it as an accounting later. He kissed the top of Doran's head once when they were alone, the way he had when they were boys. Dorne closed his eyes without embarrassment and leaned into the kiss with an honesty that made Oberyn's heart ache in the right places. Letters came back from the city that smelled of smoke and garlic. They said, "Something is changing." They did not say, "We know you are changing it." Oberyn kissed the seal of each and gave a coin to the messenger with a word that made the coin heavier in the hand. On the night before they would set a larger piece in motion, one that would touch the purse of a man who believed himself untouchable because he ate beside a dwarf of a conscience and did not choke. Oberyn stood alone on the terrace. The sea lay like a creature at rest. He spoke, not loudly, to the woman whose skull had broken long ago. He told her, without apology, that he had not chosen fire. He told her that he had chosen something slower, which meant that there would be hours that looked like surrender. He asked her forgiveness for those hours and promised her the shape of a world in which her name could be said by children without the taste of metal on their tongues. He felt Ilaria arrive behind him. She did not touch him. Her presence was its own gesture. "You speak to ghosts now," she said softly. "I speak to promises," he said. "Ghosts are the way promises have chosen to keep us honest." "Keep yourself alive," she said. "Promises are poor companions in graves." He turned and could not help the grin. "You have made a poet of me," he said. "I have made a man who is less afraid to hear himself," she answered, "and more dangerous because he is." He loved her with the suddenness of men who fear what morning will do. When they lay afterward, breath slowing in rhymes, he told her one more truth he had not planned to share. "If this fails," he said, "if I have misjudged the appetite of the city for its own unmaking, if Tywin finds a way to make our strings into a harp for his songs, I will go myself. I will go with the spear. I will make of the failure a story men can carry more easily. I will not ask anyone else to make that story." She raised herself on one elbow and looked at him for a long time, then nodded once. "You will do what you must," she said, "and I will make sure your daughters learn to call it by its right name." In the city far away, 1,000 small pieces slid half an inch on 1,000 floors. A woman laughed at the wrong joke and in doing so learned that she was angry. A man brought the wrong purse to a table and discovered that the right purse had been lifted from his belt by a boy who would never be caught because the boy was learning to belong to parts of the city that did not exist on maps. A Septon wrote a sermon about humility and then, when no one came to hear it, went instead to the tavern and told a story about a king who might be happier as a baker's son. Someone listened and repeated it in the hearing of a cousin of a lord too sure of his invitations. An iron ring slipped off a door at midnight and clanged on stone with the sound of the first note of an old song. Oberyn slept. Tyrion did not. He stood again at the window and watched the fountain carve a coin of light in the pool. He tried to imagine his father's face when the first true tremor entered the old man's hand. He tried to imagine not having to imagine it. He thought of telling Jaime one day that he had helped to pull away the chair, and in that fantasy Jaime did not call him a monster or a coward. Jaime simply took a breath and said, very softly, "I know." He laughed at himself then, without cruelty. When he turned from the window, he kicked his toe against a chest and swore because it hurt. The world, he thought with gratitude that embarrassed him, was still composed of small, stupid pains. Grand ones would come when they were ready. In the hour before dawn, as the birds rehearsed their lines for the day, a rider came from the west gate with a satchel under his shirt and dust up to his knees. He had changed horses twice and cheated an old woman out of a cup of water. He was prepared to be ungenerous with himself about the latter for the rest of his life and so perhaps deserve whatever coin the prince gave him. He fell asleep in the stable with the satchel still strapped to him and did not wake when a hand deft as a cat's slipped the strap loose and took the satchel to the small room under the stairs where letters were stripped of their seals and dressed again. The letter said, "A man sneezed in the council chamber today. Men sneeze." But then Tywin looked up as if someone had tasted his name. The letter said, "The queen broke a cup." Then, when no one moved to replace it, she took her own dress and wiped the spill from the table. Then, as if embarrassed by having been a servant to some water, she laughed and told a joke about whores washing away their sins. The letter said, "The watch has refused a bribe in the East Docks without being asked to. Something is happening to their sense of themselves." Oberyn read and felt the pace of his heart change. He did not smile. He did not call for wine. He set the paper down and looked at the garden as if it could offer a reply. It did in its way. A child shrieked joy at a frog. A man smacked another's hand away from a pomegranate as if the fruit were an unfaithful wife. The fountain offered its endless argument about gravity. The world continued. That was the best condition under which to pull a chair. He went to find Tyrion. He found him with wet hair and a towel around his neck, fresh from allowing children to convince him that he could float. The towel made him look for an instant like a monk of some peculiar cheerful order. Oberyn told him the contents of the letter in a voice as if he were discussing a recipe. "Then we begin to lift," Tyrion said, and the sentence made him straighten in a way that made his usual stoop look, for the first time, like a choice rather than a sentence. "What is the first board you ask me to pry?" Oberyn told him the name of a man who had made his fortune moving candles from one side of a city to another and charging for the privilege. Men who control light become convinced they control questions. Tyrion laughed, not unkindly, and said he had been waiting his entire life to make a candle merchant important. They went together to Doran's arcade, where the air and the decisions were cooler. The day lifted its face to them like a woman asking for a kiss. They would not hurry it. They would not set fire to a single storage house when a rumor could do more in 2 weeks than ashes could do in a night. They would remember their dead not by counting skulls, but by counting the hours redeemed from the stupidity of kings. If blood came, and it would, then it would come without the cheering of men in cuffs. If victory came, and it might, then it would be a quiet room where the old man reached for a chair and grasped air. They would let the city learn its own weight. They would let the chair learn how it felt to be in absence. And somewhere, in a tower built to make men forget how many stairs they have climbed, a man whose hands had never trembled in public had to place a palm on the table to rise. There was no one to see it, not yet. That was fine. Oberyn preferred his victories early and unobserved. He preferred them like seeds. He pressed his thumbs together and pictured the chair sliding away. He pictured the old man's F.A. See, he thought of Elia. He thought of oranges. He thought of the exact sound a spear makes when it enters a truth that cannot be argued with. He closed his eyes and breathed. The day went with him. The plan stood up gently and began to walk. Tyrion began with ink and patience. He wrote to the candle merchant as if to an equal, a subtle flattery, and asked questions no man had asked the merchant in years. How many ships had he at dock, and of those, how many paid rent to a rival house whose ships were painted a husk-dull red? How often did rats ruin tallow in summer? Could wax be made to smell of cinnamon without the cost breaking the nose? In the space between such questions, he tucked a line drawn from memory of a treatise on light that Maester Willen had once thought too dull to finish. Men like the merchant loved any thought that made their ordinary work sound like doctrine. He asked, last of all, whether the merchant ever wished, when he saw a city room by room, flame by flame, to own the dark as well as the light. That line was the hook. Owning darkness sounded like a sacrament. The reply came in a weak, thick with submissive pride. The merchant had never been addressed as if his hands were a priest's. He sent back figures with the care of a man counting a flock he had never thought worth naming. He confessed to tallow ruined by heat and mice, to wax spoiled by cheap oil, to a nephew who skimmed coin so timidly that it insulted both thief and victim. Tyrion replied with a small scold for failing to act on the nephew and a larger kindness for confessing. He drew the man into the habit of confessing. It is a short road from counting mice to counting sins one has not admitted even to oneself. Oberyn, while the candle merchant learned humility disguised as ambition, worked the ledger of the river. He sent a girl from his household, nimble of tongue and ankle, to sit evenings where ferrymen cursed their ropes. She learned in 3 nights that 2 of the 4 ferries at the Mudgate had a superstition about crossing when the moon wore a certain crooked grin. The superstition cost the city 2 hours on certain days, and 2 hours cost bribes, and bribes swelled small men into the sort of men who could one day betray an oath in the right direction. He bought the superstition the way one buys a song, with coin and a request to sing it louder. Soon even men who had not believed began to wait for the moon to change its mouth. The city's pulse hiccuped, an offbeat so small no drummer would notice, and yet the dancers missed a step. A letter from the Iron Bank arrived at last, written by a clerk whose hand had been trained to apologize for its own looped vowels. The clerk thanked the prince's household for its thoughtful arithmetic, noted without praise or disdain that the balance of liabilities west of the Mander shows an appetite outstripping grain, and closed with the sentence Tyrion read 3 times for its flavor. The bank, being a thinking thing, prefers to lend to minds rather than names. Oberyn laughed openly when Tyrion read it aloud. They want to be complimented for pretending their coin does not smell of kings, he said. Let us compliment them again. They did not hurry. The second string they drew taut ran from a poor sept near the hook to a dockside counting house whose safe smelled of cloves. A young septon of good looks and undamaged faith had made himself beloved among fishwives and blacksmiths' daughters by speaking more of bread than of chastity. He did not know that a woman who left half a loaf on his steps each week was the sister of a sallow-faced clerk who wore the key to the counting house like a talisman under his shirt. The clerk had a child with a cough that seized him like an enemy each night. The septon had a remedy, honey boiled with thyme and a pinch of poppy scraped so fine it kept its secret. The clerk's gratitude became conversation. Conversation became a small favor, a ledger left open on a desk while a man said his prayers. Tyrion copied the page onto his tongue and carried it home in silence. It was not proof of anything mortal men would hang for, but it revealed a habit. A certain house subtracted 3 from every tally and wrote the 3 back in another column the next day, and the next and the next. Subtractions become braids when no one cuts them. Braids can be pulled. Dorne kept his patience. He held court for those who came with complaints about goats and walls and the price of water in a year with a longer throat than usual. He heard petitions with the forbearance of a man who has taught himself to weep in slow motion. Having given Oberyn the leash he knew his brother required to breathe, he did not tug it unless a child tripped directly in front of the plan. When Arion brought him gossip about a Volantene envoy whose jewels had blinded half the courtyard, he smiled and asked, without looking toward Oberyn, how many stones were set with flaws a jeweler could exploit. 4, she said, caught and glowed to be caught. Even flaws were instruments here. The first true test came not from a letter or a ledger but from the sea. A Lysine caravel wallowed into Planky Town with her rudder wounded and her captain's pride bleeding to match. The man swore someone had cut his guidance rope in the night as he lay at anchor off the mouth of the river. He swore more loudly when he realized the little navy of Planky Town meant to turn him into lesson and coin. Oberyn sent money for repairs and the lesson, and privately bought the rope from the boy who had sold it cut to the captain in the first place. The boy, brass-eyed and jumpy, told the truth without language. The cut had been clumsy, not the work of a hand that lives from rope. Tyrion turned the rope in his fingers in the garden and said nothing, but his mouth smiled on one side, the mouth of a man who has found the edge of a map where no one thought there was sea. In King's Landing, a rat catcher disappeared. No one noticed except the rats and one woman 2 doors from the Street of Silk who remembered his habit of whistling a tune about mulberries out of season. A boy took his place who whistled the same tune exactly wrong, and in that small wrongness Tyrion's scriptmakers found a way to write a comedy with a rat who told the king the truth in squeaks and lived. Children in the lowest alleys squeaked at each other for a week. The guards learned to hear mockery in the sound and went home with their tempers sore. The city's underskin prickled. 1,000 irritations will do what one sword cannot. Oberyn met with the captains of the Greenblood, not as a prince but as a man willing to drink the river's mud if that pleased them. He asked them to keep their boats along the banks on certain days and in the channel on others when they would rather the opposite. He asked nothing that would starve a belly to make a point. Captains will indulge arithmetic if they are first made to feel like conspirators in a joke. He told them one about a lion who, too lazy to chase prey, lay by a ferry and roared each time a boat approached so the oarsman would offer him fish out of fear. And then what? Asked a woman with shoulders like cleats. And then someone brought a mirror, Oberyn said. The lion roared and saw his own mouth and the fish fell out. They laughed in the way river people do when a prince proves himself willing to be a fool for a second to make a truth easy to carry. The boats moved when he asked. On those days the mud gate learned to sweat. The chair in the tower creaked. Tywin, who loved silence almost as much as victory, heard it and told himself it was the wood reminding him of age rather than the world. He was too proud to turn and look at the joint. A second creak, a week later. He did not hear because Cersei broke a pearl against her throat while speaking, and the little skittering of white across tile drew all eyes as if some god had thrown them bones to see how they jumped. In a room below that room, a scribe spilled wine on a map of the Crownlands and wiped it with a sleeve, and in wiping moved a pin half an inch west. A messenger saw the new place and rode for it at dusk. Sometimes a city conspires not out of loyalty but out of fatigue. It is easier to help a plan you cannot see than to resist a tide that will soak your boots. Letters multiplied. A man from Gulltown wrote that he had heard a rumor of the Iron Bank turning its head fractionally toward dragons minted in a different fire. A street-born girl wrote to her cousin in Sunspear of how the queen had cut her finger on a shard of pearl and did not bleed as much as she ought to. The girl used the story to say that the queen was not quite human and therefore must be feared. Her cousin used the story to say the queen was not quite human and therefore must be pitied. Each version traveled down alleys that never met, and yet each arrived at the same door, where men wished to hate with less effort. Tyrion, reminded every day by the fountain that water teaches patience in the language of falling, drew up the first list of men to be offered chairs. Not comfortable chairs, he told Oberyn, and not chairs in rooms with windows, stools in closets, a place to sit while they decide to move their weight from the leg of Tywin's table to ours. He named 3, a ledger warrior at the port who had once sold contraband salted plums to a Baratheon boy on a dare and still told the story when drunk. A Sioux officer among the gold cloaks who slept with the same man every market day and therefore believed himself a paragon. A tailor who hemmed ruffles for Cersei and had begun to hate silk. All 3 were ordinary. Their ordinariness was the point. Chairs multiplied best among people who had never imagined asking for one. Ellaria went north without announcement, a ripple in silk. She wore a name no one would remember and a braid like a promise. She did not go to the brothels first. She went to the laundresses. Women who wash kings are the bank in which every debt is recorded and eventually rubbed thin. Ellaria told jokes cruel enough to earn trust and then offered small reliefs. Clothespins carved so they did not bite as hard. A salve for wrists that the rope had taught to ache. A string of strong curses for the names of men who asked for more without paying for more. She spent coin like water but left it in hands that would not throw it back toward the sea. In a fortnight she could say which guard captain wore his anger like perfume and which cook added too much pepper when ordered to be obedient. She returned with a scent in her hair he could not name. Soap and smoke and that iron filing smell the city leaves on lovers when it has lain between their bodies. In bed she told him without telling him what she had bought. For women who could smile like a saint and lie like a widow, one man who knew how to make wine taste of anything but itself, and the address of a stair that only rats and the queen's maid used. "How do you know?" he asked, and she put his hand on the underside of her braid. Between the plaits was a thin thread of gold with notches along it. Each notch answered to a face she had memorized and a habit she had taught herself to love until it could be used. "I know because I have learned to listen where words are ashamed to go," she said. "Dorne taught me to drink. King's Landing is teaching me to sip. Dorne blessed motions by failing to forbid them." He offered the occasional counsel that turned out to be a governor split between wheels, a resistance that did not slow the carriage, only kept it from flying apart. He asked after the candle merchant one afternoon with such bland inquiry that Tyrion laughed aloud. "He wrote that he has begun to pray to the god of wax," Tyrion said. "If we are not careful, we shall wake a new sect." "Let them light their candles to whomever," Doran said, and shifted his foot with a whin. See, he did not bother to hide. So long as they do not see only by their own light. He was not always patient. When word came that a young Dornish rider had been beaten by Lannister men-at-arms on the Rose Road for daring to wear a spear on his cloak, Doran called in the captain of the nearest watch and spoke like a man whose pain had chosen to stand. "Break not a man's face," he said. "Break his belief that he can break ours without consequence." The captain rode with 15 men to the farmhouse where the armsmen had pissed behind pomegranates. The watch entered not with swords but with ledgers and fines the size of a fattened pig. It is a hard thing for a man trained to fear steel to learn to fear ink. Men grumbled louder at the ink. The gold was heavier than blood. It taught them in a place blood had spared. A year might have passed in that balance of small tremors and careful rejoicing if not for a lion's roar made at the wrong hour. A caravan loaded with myrrh and barley and the stubborn pride of the Reach had been stopped at the city's western gate by a clerk who had decided, 2 nights previous, to challenge every 5th cart for the joy of making men wait. The Reach men, taught since infancy that waiting is what others do for their wine, pushed. A gold cloak tried to push back. Somebody's knee slipped on somebody's patience. A man fell and cracked his head in a manner that sounded more official than it was. By the time the gong sounded, 3 men bled on cobbles and a woman was screaming that her child had been taken. Tyrion read the account from 3 messengers and threw one into the basin to watch the ink bloom like rot. "This is the moment," he said. "Not because of the blood, because the wrong woman screamed." "Who?" Oberyn asked. "Not a mother," Tyrion said. "A seller of sweet beer whose voice calls to soldiers with thirst and boys with tongues too bold. The city listens to her pitch daily. When she screams, they think they owe her attention. We cannot let the next voice be a Lannister's." "Whose then?" "A man who owns nothing but his cart," Tyrion said, almost joyous with the precision of it. "He will call for calm. He will say the words men long to hear when their dignity has been bruised. No one meant to insult you. Everything will be put aright. You are seen. He will not be believed, not entirely, but he will be believed enough. And while calm folds itself into the crowd like a clean cloth, we will take something, a very small thing, something that belongs to Tywin." They chose a warehouse key. It was not even Tywin's key. It belonged to a borrower of Tywin's patience, which is the most expensive loan any man can take. Illyria gave the signal with a scarf nodded to mean rain. A boy who had learned to whistle mulberries out of season delivered a basket of dried fish to a guard who craved salt. The guard, happy in a narrow way, left his post to piss after the beer seller's scream had broken and mended. The key moved, kissed palm then palm, and made its way to a woman who had learned to carry it under her breast where even the hungriest hands did not go without invitation. That night, 6 crates of candles left one warehouse and entered another. The candles looked the same. They were not the same. They had been cut and wicks shortened, and stamped with a star too small for comfortable eyes. The next evening, when the queen asked for the hall to be brilliant enough to drown doubt, servants set the star-stamped wax in gilt cups. 2 hours later, the hall dimmed by a shade so slight that one could have blamed the moon. Cersei did not blame the moon. She blamed sloth. She blamed a servant who had been at her side since girlhood. She sent the woman away with a slap hard enough to wring the ear and satisfy nothing. The woman cried in a corridor and swore to a friend that the queen would learn to love the dark. The friend knew a man who brewed beer. The beer tasted bitter that week. Men drank in fewer cups. Fewer cups are quieter than many. In the quiet, men hear themselves plan. Tywin received reports that did not declare themselves to be reports. A silence accrued like dust in a house no one feels compelled to sweep. He began to dream of chairs in odd places. A chair floating down the river with a cat seated upon it. A chair in the burnt-out shell of a bakery that no one had bothered to reconstruct because bread was cheaper at the stall next door. A chair in his hall that looked precisely like his chair and yet, in the dream, was always a half-inch too far to the left. When he woke, he moved his real chair a finger width to the right, then back, and told himself he had always preferred it where it was. Jaime came to him with a question in his face he had never before displayed near his father. "Have you noticed," he said, "that men who knew how to stand straight no longer do? They hunch at the wrist. It's a curious hunch, as if ready to sign something they don't yet understand." Tywin told him to watch the gate schedules. Jaime did, and returned a week later with a piece of folded paper bearing times that did not match the column beside them. "I can't decide if it's incompetence or perversity," he said, half amused, half angry, and more alive in confusion than he had been in certainty. Tywin made a sound that could have been a laugh but wasn't. "Both," he said. "Always both. Go to the counting house. Sit on a stool and read what bores you. What bores you describes you." Jaime went. He sat. He read until his eyes felt salted. He learned nothing except how hunger makes itself known in a clerk's marginalia. Nevertheless, the building had been altered by a man who had sat without being asked to in it. Chairs, like rumors, multiply when men forget who owns them. In Sunspear, Oberyn trained without the spear for a week. He wore weights sewn into his sleeves and wrists, teaching his muscles to prefer tasks they would not be given. He walked in the gardens and counted without counting. The steps from lattice to pool, the breaths between a child's choice to run and the moment her foot slipped. the heartbeats in Illyria's throat when she laughed after being startled by a lizard pretending to be a dragon. He gave his daughters different insults than usual so that the usual insults would not lose their sting. He told Nymeria that her beauty was as dangerous to her as a straight road to a horse. He told Tyrion that righteousness must learn to move like oil if it means to live among gears. He told Oberyn, who had come reluctantly, who came always reluctantly, that anger was the only honest coin most men had, which is why princes must learn to spend it better than the men who own it. She did not thank him. She came again the next morning. Tyrion found a kind of health he had not expected among the figs and children. It was not a cure. It was an accounting. He drank less because the wine asked less of him. He ate better because the bread did not taste of calculation. He stood, sometimes, before the lattice and allowed the same wind that touched boy and girl and prince to touch him as if it were not stealing. He wrote in a hand steadier than he had given himself credit for. He taught a boy of 12 to count with pebbles, and when the boy used the pebbles to cheat his sister out of a date, the mother looked at Tyrion with such gentle condemnation that he found himself apologizing and returning the date with interest. He woke one morning with the thought that he did not understand the word home, and that lack felt less like a wound and more like a challenge. Quiet victories collect a scent. Illyria smelled it first in a letter that had nothing to say. A scribe in the Red Keep apologizing for a misplaced ribbon that had been meant for the master of ship's notice. The apology was properly worded, inking bow over bow. What it confessed without meaning to was that someone had entered the room where the ribbons hung and moved 3 of the 5 to the right. The master of ships never looked left first. Things delayed themselves. Illyria licked her thumb and tapped the margin where the scribe had pressed too hard. "He is loyal," she said. "Loyalty bruises paper like this." Oberyn made a note. "Loyal men can be loosened if they are taught to love their own competence more than their duty." Arianne grew restless at being used as a cat only to watch. She wanted to pounce. Dorne let her write to a Tyrell cousin she had met once on a balcony, permitted a line about flowers that remembered how the sun had felt the day they were cut, and then took the letter from her hand and burned it before her eyes. "If you wish your words to be weapons," he said, not unkindly, "you must first learn where their hilts are. Show me the hilt next time. I will keep the blade." She left angrier than she let show, returned the following evening with a second letter written not with her beauty but with her boredom, and Dorne smiled in a way that did not move more than the corners of his mouth. "Now it is safe to send," he said, "because it does not look like you." The candle merchant entered the second stage of his conversion. He began to write of himself in third person in the margins of his own ledger. The merchant believes, the merchant regrets, the merchant foresees, until at last he used a name he had not been given, the steward. Tyrion underlined it twice and showed Oberyn as if he had found a coin under a root. "He names himself steward," he said. "Men who leap to steward from merchant wish to know what it is to rule without having to see themselves wearing a crown. Offer him a crown he can wear without looking in a glass. Give him the lighting of one street for a week. Let him see children point and say his name when the lamps are lit on time. Then let him write to his nephew that theft is forbidden and virtue rewarded. Make him feel his virtue." Oberyn did. For a week, one street glowed like a remark made at the correct volume. On the 8th day, the mother of a child who had feared the dark all her life came to the merchant's door with a sheep's milk cheese she could not afford to give. The merchant wept over it, privately, noiselessly, and ate none of it. He left it on the sill to smell like forgiveness until it rotted. The first coin of blood came, despite their artistry, because the world dislikes too much finesse. It was drawn not by Lannister hand but by a sellsword in the hook, a man whose sword had always meant to be honest until hunger dulled its conscience and drink sharpened its variety of courage. He killed another sellsword over a line in a tale about the Queen's brother's bed. The dead man had owed coin to a boy who ran letters for a woman who washed the city's grief off the palace linen. The boy came to the woman. The woman came, wringing the cloth in her hands, to a man who had once been a fat child mocked for his wrists and who had taught himself to become thinner than anyone expected. The thin man chose to hang the killer in a way that drew notice without drawing eyes, in a courtyard where only the victims of the city's drunkards passed. The body swung in windless shame, No proclamación, no trampit. Those who saw had been the ones who needed to see. They told the story quietly as an instruction. Even justice here learned to be specific. Tywin noticed the blood in the wrong way. He did not ask what had happened, only whether anyone had made a speech. When told no, he said the most dangerous thing a man like him can say, "Good." He believed silence served him. He did not imagine silence could be married elsewhere. The chair slid another half-inch in a dream. Tywin reached for it and caught air. He woke with his hand open and fingers spread. He had not spread his fingers in sleep since boyhood. The memory of that boy limped through his morning like a dog allowed into a room at last and finding it did not remember the furniture. Tyrion dreamed too, but his dream was of the water. Gardens without children. The fountain ran without witnesses. He woke fearing he had made a mistake he could not name. He went to the fountain and found two girls sitting with their knees drawn up, whispering about a lizard with missing toes. He stood in the doorway until his fear withdrew, chastened, and then went to Dorne and spoke, for the first time, of what he wanted that was not vengeance. "I want to be able to walk again into a room without calculating it," he said. "I want to speak foolishly without having to loathe myself after. I want a chair that does not require a sword beside it to be mine." "Then you will not live in King's Landing," Dorne said. "No one lives there. They only survive." "I know," Tyrion said. "I want to ruin it enough that my siblings cannot pretend their survival is living." "Is that justice?" Dorne asked. He did not ask it like a priest. He asked it like a man testing a plank across a ditch. "It is the only kind I am strong enough to carry," Tyrion said. "Better men than me can carry others." Dorne nodded as if to himself. "We will try to make yours heavier then," he said, "so that it will be worthy." From Old Town came the first true ally with a chain around his neck. They had not expected one. He arrived without heraldry and wearing travel dust like a garment he had invented. He was young enough to be proud and old enough to hide it. He said little, and what he did say he wrapped in the sort of careful boredom maesters used to keep their curiosity from burning them. Oberyn liked him because he confessed in the first hour to a single sin that made itself expensive. He adored puzzles so much he would stop in doorways to admire the fit of a hinge. "You will go to King's Landing," Oberyn said, "and you will stand at doors. You will look like a man deciding whether to step in. People will hurry you or ignore you. Both will tell you who they are." The maester bowed as if he had been knighted and did not thank them. Gratitude wastes measurement. He wore out 3 pairs of cheap sandals in a season and sent back 7 letters, all with the same sentence hidden in different corners of the page. The city is forgetting its habits. Forgetfulness moved through the court like a perfume no one had paid for. A basket of pomegranates meant for the queen's table arrived at the hands instead. A coat of a guard went missing and was found on a chair in the Tower of the Hand. The guard swore he had never sat in that chair, and no one believed he had, and yet the coat had found comfort there. A performance in a square near the hill made a joke about a lord whose name began with T and ended with YN and who loved chairs more than his children. The audience laughed as they are required to laugh when a safe joke is told by a man with painted cheeks. 2 men did not laugh. They looked at each other as if one had heard the other fart in a library. Oberyn chose this moment to buy a debt he did not want with money he hated. It belonged to a cassock-wearing fool who had always believed his god would cancel columns for him when he prostrated correctly, and who was learning that gods created arithmetic to punish the devout. The debt's owner had walked a circuit from Lannisport to King's Landing so many times an imprint of his heels appeared on one tavern's plank. Oberyn purchased the man's ledger and taught him a new route. From tavern to tavern in the city, speaking of a prince he had never seen who settled accounts without demanding a name in exchange. He spoke in the tone of a revelation cracked from an egg long boiled. Half the city, listening with lopsided attention, forgot which debts were owed to Lannisters and which to an idea. A woman who had never forgiven a guard for taking her bread at a gate said to her neighbor at dusk, "Perhaps the world is not so mean as the man who stood at that door." And the neighbor, who washed Tywin's cups, replaced one with a cup bearing a tiny scratch on its rim. Tywin drank and did not bleed. The scratch was a message to no one. Messages to no one are how cities write to themselves. A raven arrived at dusk with a note only Dorne read, lips barely moving. He sat with it long enough for the light to go from gold to the color of old lemons. Then he folded the paper and handed it to Oberyn. The letter spoke of a marriage proposed for a distant cousin of a cousin. A baited hook with gold leaf, the sort of Tyrell flourish that had caught more than one fish. Dorne asked, "Do we bite?" Oberyn shook his head. "We let the fish think the river is sweet. Then we salt it." He wrote a courteous refusal gilded with a promise of future visit. He wrote a second letter to a woman at the arbor whose oldest son had once sent a poem to Tyrion full of bees and disobedience. He reminded her of the bees and praised the disobedience. The woman sent back wine, too sweet by half, and a warning that the Reach was listening to the crack in the capital's voice. Men gathered in a room inside the Red Keep without choosing to gather. No one sent them. They arrived one by one for different reasons and found themselves committing an error together. They told the truth about their fears. A minor lord whose holdings had been bent into circles by the city's latest fashion for fences said the city no longer felt like a creature he could predict. "It feels like a woman who has suddenly stopped answering." Another man, with a scar down one cheek that no story satisfactorily explained, said the queen's temper had become a wager. He lost coin daily guessing whether she would speak to the second son of a man who mattered less since he had gone gray. A third man, who did not talk, listened and then, overcompensating for listening, offered to beat someone. The silence that followed that offer was a map of the whole realm. Tywin heard about the room from Jaime, who heard about it from a man who had sat on the edge of it pretending to sleep. Tywin said the thing a man says when the river begins to tell him where it wants to go. "Let them talk." Cersei said the second thing. "Find the room." The room moved. Oberyn sent Ellaria back with a knife whose sheath looked like a comb. She wore it in her hair and smiled the way a woman smiles who knows she can unmake a room with her fingers and chooses to use her voice. She did not need the knife. She used the comb to fix the hair of the beer seller whose scream had been useful and, in the fixing, asked a question that had to be answered. "When did you last think of your own comfort?" The woman had to think hard. "Perhaps when my mother died," she said, and laughed at herself. Ellaria told that laugh 3 times in 3 different beds, and in each the man who paid promised to confess to something in the morning. Men are generous in the dark. The chair in the tower shifted once more. It was not a dream. The servants moved it nightly by a fingernail and then moved it back the following night, making it a habit that undid itself. On the 7th night, one forgot to move it back. Tywin sat and knew, only because the body tells, something was crooked. He adjusted. He would be adjusting now every day for the rest of his life. He did not think it strange. He thought it maintenance. And then came the hour no plan can survivingly avoid, the hour of accident. A cart, broken at a wheel, spilled apples into the street near the Lion Gate. Men chasing sugar fell into men chasing time. A blade came out where a hand should have been. A woman fell in exactly the place where a voice carries best. "Murder," she cried, as so many have cried in places where murder was only impatience with breath. The cry gathered a coat of meanings. The crowd thickened the way milk does in a jar shaken by bored children. A gold cloak raised a baton to look like control. Tyrion's name was spoken by a boy who had once been handed a coin by a dwarf who taught him how to divide dates evenly among sisters and nonetheless keep the largest bit. The boy said only, "The man with the small lion told me to count," and someone heard only lion, and someone else heard only man, and all heard count. Ellaria stepped into the crowd with her comb in her hair. She did not speak the truth. She spoke the thing the crowd wanted to be true, that the dead man, whose eyes still had not chosen which direction to point, had been a thief and not a martyr. She made the word thief sound almost tender. The crowd, grateful to be freed of heroism, let itself be put down. The gold cloak breathed as if he had survived a duel. The apples went back into the cart, one bruised half at a time, and somewhere above the scene a scribe wrote, "For himself only, the city wishes to go on." Oberyn read that line as if it were a benediction. He kissed the courier on both cheeks, shamed him with praise, and sent him back with a piece of candied orange that would keep his mouth busy when he wished to gossip. "Now," he said to Doran and Tyrion and Ellaria and Arianne, and the maester who had returned with cracked sandals and 3 new notches of wisdom on the thin gold wire hidden under Ellaria's braid. "Now we test a board." He named a man who had always sat 1 chair closer to Tywin than his intelligence deserved. A middleman of middling appetites, whose life had been a study in how to be near the source of heat without ever putting a hand too close to the flame. He had an old mother who took snuff and swore at pigeons, and a young mistress who preferred old wine. Oberyn had no intention of threatening either. He intended to give the man a chance to be better than he was. Tyrion wrote the letter, gentle as rainfall, praising small competences, apologizing for asking a favor that would put the man in no danger and yet make him feel he had something to lose. "People are strangest," Tyrion said, "when they begin to believe they own the thing they almost own." The favor was to send a single order to a single office telling a single runner to deliver a single sealed packet to a single notary, and to do so with 1 hour's delay. The packet contained nothing. The delay contained the world. In that hour, a ship would leave with a crate of lamp oil stamped with the wrong mark. The mark would be recorded by a boy in the oil yard who had been told that marks are the only way the city remembers itself. The boy would recount the mark to a woman who had once fixed Ellaria's braid. The woman would tell a man with a chair in a closet. The man would write to Sunspear. The letter came. The lamp oil arrived at a dock with a different clerk than usual. The boy recited the mark and the clerk scowled and wrote it quickly, and the scowl lodged in his face like a crust, changing the way he spoke to his wife that evening. "It is too small," Arianne said, disappointed, when she read the report. "No one will notice." Doran pointed at the bottom of the page, where the maester's neat hand had added, "The clerk's wife is cousin to the tailor who hems the queen's sleeves." "No one notices," Doran said, "until the tailor asks for better light to see the tiny stitches, and the queen wonders why, and someone says, because the lamp oil smoked the seam last night. It was slow. It was almost stupid in its slowness. It required a dignity men seldom allow plans. The temptation to press, to take a spear and prod the city in the ribs until it drew breath like a spooked horse, crept on Oberyn's back at night and laid its chin in the cradle of his shoulder. He let it rest there. He did not feed it. A raven brought news that could not be ignored. A ship from Myr had burned in the bay 2 hours before dawn. Men swore it had been an accident of tar and negligence. A woman swore she had seen a shadow move along the water like a spill of oil and then leap to the ship in silence. Silence makes a better witness than most men. Panic owned the morning. The city burped fear. Tywin ordered inspections. Cersei ordered accusations. The boy king screamed. Once at a fly and then cried because flies do not care for crowns. The city watch dragged nets through the lower harbor and caught a certainty. A coil of soaked rope spliced with a knot no ordinary sailor in King's Landing had learned. It was a Dornish knot. The city had been taught by bards that knots can be passports. Oberyn received the rumor as it was meant to be received, with a private cold and a public warmth. He took Ellaria's hand and kissed her fingers beneath the pomegranate tree and said words children could hear. That if any man had thrown fire in his name, that man had mistaken both his name and his aim. He sent a letter with the maester's slower raven. He sent a second letter with a boy who could swim like a lizard. The second contained only a knot, tied wrong on purpose, and a line. "This is not ours." In the city, a fisherwoman read the knot and agreed. She threw the knot into a bucket. Her son tied it correctly. His friend untied it and made a different knot altogether, one from Bravos. Children corrected a rumor before men could. Tyrion was the first to say it aloud at Doran's table. "He is leaning." He did not need to say who. The windows wore a light that made men honest and ugly. "He is leaning," Tyrion repeated. "And when men lean, they begin to reach for things to keep from falling. That is when hands can be slapped." He folded his hands together and looked not at the map but at the fruit on the plate. A chopped orange, a fig ripped open, a pomegranate with seeds scattered like rubies spilled out of a necklace. "We must decide what we want him to reach for." "Cersei," Ellaria said at once, without bitterness. "He will reach for his daughter." Men who cannot admit their age reach for the thing they made so they can pretend they are making again. We should make her slippery. How? Arion asked, hungry. With wine? With men? With shame? With a mirror? With the one thing she cannot bear, Ilaria said. Pity. There was a silence then in which the fountain could be heard insisting on gravity. Pity, when placed correctly, is a noose. Tyrion understood at once. He had been pitted by men who loved him and pitted by men who would have killed him and sometimes could not tell which burned him worse. How? He asked, cautious. Without making orphans of children whose lives have been a carnival of pity since birth? By moving the mirror, Ilaria said. By showing her not herself, but what she does to others when she is not looking. A play, not for the squares, for the September. A morality that ends with a queen who wishes to be pitied and learns that pity is a door that opens only into rooms with no chairs. Dornish heresy in the September? Doran frowned, and Oberyn saw the map in his brother's mind change color in one corner. They will burn the stage. Then they will notice there was a stage, Ilaria answered. And perhaps the carpenter who built it already owes his rent to a man who will not raise it if the stage is rebuilt in a cellar rather than a nave. Tyrion's face twisted with relish and constraint. If we do this, we cannot control the laughter, he said. If it comes, it will climb where it wants. If it does not, we shall have merely rehearsed for ourselves in an empty room. We will risk the empty room, Oberyn said. It is better than setting fire to a full one. The play was written in 3 nights by a woman who had once written love letters for coin and had learned that men prefer to be told about their own virtues as if by accident. It told the story of a queen of glass who believed herself steel and a king of bread who believed himself a sword. The king broke his teeth on the queen's edge. The queen shattered when a child touched her too boldly. The moral was clumsy. The jokes were good. The carpenter built a stage that could be removed in 6 minutes and stored behind a false wall. The septon who watched from the back row the afternoon of rehearsal wrote in his own margin, reluctant. It is true, he did not know which part he confessed. Cersei heard of it on the 2nd day and went to the September herself. She wore pity like a cloak she had not been taught to use and demanded the play be stopped because it offended the mother. The septon, honest man, looked at the stage and thought of the line he had written. He chose, helplessly, to defend a thing he had been prepared to destroy, because men hate to betray their freshest thought. The play moved to the cellar. The cellar filled. Tywin, told by a page with no sense for metaphor, said, "Let them have their entertainments," and returned to a letter about wolves in the Riverlands. It would not be theater that broke him, nor a single clever knot, nor a stolen candle, nor even a chair that refused to stay where he wanted. It would be the accumulation of small repositions, the insult of a city learning to locate itself without asking his permission. Men like Tywin endure blows. They do not abide thefts of orientation. In an office dimmed by star-stamped wax, he signed an order he had signed 100 times, and for the first time in his life he did not recognize his own signature until he had finished it. The change passed like indigestion, left him angrier than appetite, and he called for a rider. He would go to the docks. He would inspect. He had not done such a thing in years. The chair scraped back. The sound made even him wince. When the news reached Sunspear, Tywin at the docks, the room where plans had been made gathered itself, like a cat making bread on a lap. "It is a vanity," Doran said, "but vanities are nails. They can tear cloth when they do not intend to." Oberyn rose. He reached for the spear and then did not take it. He took instead a hat with a ridiculous feather and put it on, relishing Arian's groan. "Do not," she said, but the grin in her mouth betrayed her. "You will be recognized." "Not with this feather," Oberyn said. He was not going. He only wanted to feel the spear's absence. He sat again and the feather tickled Ilaria's cheek. She swatted him as if he were a fly and did not bother to hide the way her eyes softened when he replaced the hat with his hand in hers. "The docks," he said. "We wanted him to reach. He has reached. We must be ready to slap." Tyrion wrote fast, without thinking the sentence to the end before placing it on the page. "Do not take him from a cart," he said. Do not take him from a speech. Take him from a pause. Men like him pause only when they feel safe. Put a boy with a box in his path. Let the boy drop the box. Let Tywin stoop. Have someone note that he stooped. Have the note spread like spice in a stew. For a man like Tywin, he stooped will rhyme with he fell. He will hear the rhyme even if no one sings it to him. Oberyn felt a boy's laugh in his own chest, the laugh he had learned to quiet when daggers made better music. Done, he said. And who will write the note? The candle merchant, Tyrion said, almost tender. He is ready to be a steward of the obvious. The boy with the box had been born to a fishwife with hands cracked like plates put too often in too hot water. He had learned already that dropping is easier than lifting, and loved tasks that let him do what weight would have done if left to itself. He was given a box that was light and told to behave as if it were heavy and precious. He had to practice. His mother laughed until she cried. You have always been a liar with your shoulders, she said, and kissed his head hard enough to bruise his memory for a week. He waited near a coil of rope behind a bollard that smelled of tar. He waited as men love to wait when they have been given a part in a play and told their line is only a noise. Tywin came as men like Tywin come, with soldiers arranged to look like an accident, with scribes arranged to look like nothing, with eyes arranged to look as if they saw everything and were inclined to forgive nothing. He moved through the dock with a speed that made men feel slow. He paused once to adjust a glove, and a fishwife, someone else's, fell in love with the sight of his exacting fingers. The boy heard a voice. Now, he stepped, tripped with a competence only boys possess, and the box slipped from his arms. It did not break. It opened with an impertinence, and inside were apples, not jewels, and one rolled precisely to Tywin's boot. Tywin bent perfectly, thoughtlessly, the way a father might, the way a man who believes the earth owes him courtesy might. His hand took the apple. He placed it back in the boy's box. The boy whispered, "My lord," with a gratitude that had been rehearsed to sound as if it could not be rehearsed. Men breathed. Someone laughed softly. That was all. The candle merchant wrote the note that evening. He wrote not on parchment but on 50 scraps of bill and ledger, where men would see words without meaning to. He wrote, he stooped. He did not add a name. He did not add a title. He did not write the word hand. He wrote, he stooped. The phrase sprouted like cress on wet cloth. Tywin did not hear it. He heard everything else. He sent a man to punish a different dock for a different slight. He allowed, without considering it allowance, a scribe to sleep an extra hour. He dreamed of a chair left of where it ought to be and woke and moved it and found he had moved it too far. He moved it back. His hands were steady. His breath was steady. His temper was steady. The world, despite him, rearranged. Oberyn and Tyrion sat with Dorne in long shadow and made the next list. It was not of men. It was of pauses. Find where he pauses, Oberyn said, and Tyrion nodded as if the sentence had been his. Find where he is most himself without armor. These are the places where the chair can be made to feel uncertain beneath him. If we cannot bring him to the floor, we will bring him to the kind of sitting that hurts the back. A man who cannot rest is a man who cannot think. They named them. At the end of council, when Jaime lingers half a step and waits to be asked a question and is not. At the moment before a seal is melted, when the candle flame trembles and a draft moves through a hall no one admits is drafty. At the threshold of his privy, where even a lion must concede to common need. They discussed the last without embarrassment and with the ruthless practicality that true conspiracies require. In the end they agreed, not there. Not because he did not deserve humiliation, but because children would one day ask for the shape of the story, and there are shapes that do not fit into lessons without curdling the mouth that tells them. They chose instead a window. Tywin had a window he preferred to stand at when letters became arguments too stupid to be called by that noble name. He looked at the city from that height the way a miser looks at coins he has no plan to spend. Filthy and beloved. The window had a latch that stuck in winter. It was summer. They tightened the latch by a hair. The next day, when he placed his palm on the sill to lean, the wood gave less than his body expected, and the expectation hurt his shoulder more than he would admit. He rubbed it once with his knuckles and told no one. That night, putting on his shirt, he winced. No one saw. No one needed to. Pain is an instrument that plays in rooms without audiences. Tyrion watched a boy in the water gardens sleep with his mouth open and wanted suddenly to weep and could not. He imagined being a man who could. He thought of writing Jaime and did not. He thought of writing no one and did. He wrote to the candle merchant and told him a lie that would make him stronger. That the city had been lit on time in 3 wards because of his care. The merchant slept that night without turning twice. In the morning, he fired his nephew without cruelty and kissed his mother's hand with a gentleness the woman understood to be foreign coin. And so the chair slid, not in one motion but in a series of adjustments. So small that even the god of chairs would have been hard-pressed to notice. Men leaned and were corrected by air. Women paused and heard their own pity and turned it aside. Children learned jokes that did not end in violence. A play in a cellar sent a woman in a tower to her glass and found a hairline she had not seen and would not confess to any man. Oberyn woke before dawn and lay on his back, listening to Ilaria breathe, and counted the beats between the first bird and the second. He had become a man who counted in dozens of registers. He imagined Elia in rooms that smelled of lemon and ash and told her again, because he needed to believe it as strongly as she required being told, that this way was the surest way to keep children from screams. If he failed, he would go to the city with a spear and become the story he had refused. He pictured himself in that story and found it wanting. He kissed Ilaria's shoulder, attended to his morning stiffening with the courtesy lovers grant one another when they know time is an enemy with a polite voice, and then rose to plan where a pause might next be coaxed into offering the city a better seat. In King's Landing the river kept its own counsel. The bells lied about what hours meant, and a man who had bent for an apple adjusted his chair by a finger width and told himself there was no lesson in fruit.